Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair for joining us today on Thought Adventure podcast on an incredibly important and obviously timely topic in terms of what's occurring in Gaza, the attacks that have taken place, the bombings, the potential for um, for ground invasion, subhanallah, and the calls by the Zionist entity for 1.1 million people to move from the north of Gaza all the way to the south. So alhamdulillah, this is a really important topic discussion that we're going to have today. Inshallah, some of the other brothers may join, the co-host Jake and Abdulrahman and Yusuf, but this discussion today is going to be a presentation not given by myself, but by an honored guest who has a particular area of expertise in this. He's going to be presenting a proper presentation, and I want people to be mindful, be clear, and I think, to be honest, if it's a case of taking notes, take notes. If it's a case of watching it again, please watch it again. Why? Because there is a propaganda war that's taking place against the Muslims and against the people of Palestine. So many arguments are being presented, so many different frameworks and narratives are being pushed. And if we as Muslims don't have the ability to articulate the response in the correct and informed way, we'll do more damage than good. So this is why we've asked our brother, Dr. Abdul Wahid, to come and present. He's presented this before on, similar presentations before on other podcasts or YouTube channels, but here he's tailored it, inshallah, for us to discuss about Zionism Unveiled. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sharif and brothers and sisters watching.
Jazakallah khair. So just, before we get into the whole discussion, the topic, I want people to really appreciate that if we're not informed about this topic, about how Zionism came about the colonialist agenda for the creation of Zionism and also creation of Israel, how Israel came about, what happened to the Palestinians. If we don't know about this, how effective can we be in terms of addressing the current political realities today?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. We will be much less effective. We're much less effective in many ways. You will find quite a lot of Zionists know some details, and they present their arguments in a certain way, and that can confuse people if you're debating with them. But I think probably where it's most useful is that there is a massive audience out there of people who just assume this is one of the same old problems in the East, where people are just fighting each other. This evening on BBC News, one of the reporters, he described what's happening there as the age-old conflict, or this ancient conflict. And that was just frankly false. It's fake. Yeah, that's just not true. It's not ancient. It's not age-old. Okay, there's a quite recent series of events. You're talking decades, 100 years, kind of that sort of time scale. And it's a lot to try and understand. It's quite complex. And I think my aim today, Sharif, for the audience is to set some of the information in a narrative that should make sense to people. And I think when I present, one thing you can do very helpfully, and the other presenters, if they come in, is if the narrative isn't clear, and if the information I'm given doesn't fit the narrative or conflicts with something else you guys know or have heard, tell me and we'll take it back on track. And I'm pretty sure, although in an hour and a half, you cannot present 100 years of history, particularly it's very complex history, but I'm pretty confident that the argument I present there is robust enough to stand up to other historical bits of information which I haven't included. And the key thing here, brothers and sisters watching, is I hope this will help us to help the Muslims in Palestine today, right? So I will be bringing up not just ancient history, not just old things, 100-year-old stuff. I'll actually, one of the reasons I'm bringing this stuff up is so that we understand some things that are going on today and actually look forward to a better future.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. And I think that's a really important point because a lot of people seem to think this is some intractable, always occurring problem that's taken place within Palestine. You know, there's always conflict between Muslims and Jews, and so it's just something that we'll never be able to solve. But I think, inshallah, with your presentation, you can explain properly how to frame it, how to understand it. And like I said, I think this is really important because as Muslims, we're not just people who are just going to react to things. If we understand deeply our history and the political reality today, we have a better, more effective, robust way to address some of the issues. So inshallah, we'll quickly just go into the presentation then. Shall I just add it onto the screen for you, Abdullah?
Yeah, do. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So you titled this episode Zionism Unveiled. I think that's a really good way to get viewers in, Sharif. I had prepared actually something a bit drier, yeah? Palestine between Zionism and colonialism. And the reason for this, guys, is this. What our brothers and sisters in Palestine are facing today are two political forces that are trying to dominate the region. And they overlap, and they've worked in synergy sometimes, and sometimes they clash. And one force is the force known as Zionism, and one is actually what I call colonialism. So how would I define those two? One is a political force that wants a nationalistic homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And the other is Western powers, originally Britain, France, later the United States, and all their allies in the West that want secular, Western, capitalist, colonial entity in the Muslim world to achieve their interest. Because that part of the world, the Middle East, it's the crossroads for everything. It really is crucial for any great power in the world to dominate that. So they want their colony in that region. And that's really what my thesis is going to present to you today. So we're going to go through a little bit about what happened in Palestine, why it's come about, these two overlapping and sometimes conflicting agendas, sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting, how it's all come about. Actually, the role of Muslim rulers in the region is really important to understand, both in terms of the problem and in terms of how we get to a solution, and a little bit about present or recent reality and the future for Palestine, inshallah. So let's go back about 109 years to the beginning of World War I. There isn't a country called Palestine. There isn't a nation state called Palestine, because actually this part of the world, we didn't do nation states, right? We had an Islamic state. We had the Ottoman state. It was not a state defined by people's race, nationality, or tribe. It was a state defined by Islam, and citizens of that state were Muslim and non-Muslim, and they were ruled by Islam. And what is called Palestine, just like the rest of Bilad al-Sham, what's called Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, all of this area was part of the Ottoman Khilafah, the Ottoman state, okay? So until World War I, if you looked on a map, they might have a district or a region called Palestine because that linked to a historic term, or Transjordan, but there were no countries there like that, but there were Palestinian people. So lie number one is the lie that there were no people there, that there was no Palestine. This is an absolute lie. There were Palestinian people there, Arabs, Muslim and Christian, who lived in that land, who farmed that land, who nurtured that land for centuries. Actually, their ancestry is probably mixed. Some of their ancestors might have been Jews who became Muslim. Some of their ancestors might have been from the Roman times. Some of their ancestors might even have predated when the Jews came. So they could be from the Canaanite people or the Philistine people that predated even the arrival of Bani Israel to that region. Okay, so there's the lie there that there was nobody in this land. And there's a misinformation that there's no state of Palestine because as I say, we didn't do nation states. This was part of the Ottoman state. We'll go into detail a bit later about that. And this is a very familiar diagram, or many of you have seen it before. So you know your history. 1914 to 1918 was World War I. So the Ottoman state was involved in World War I, and the most extreme diagram on the left shows that what happened at the end of World War I, and Britain and France carved up the Middle East between them. You know, France took Syria, Lebanon, Britain took Jordan and Palestine, right? And they put proxies into these countries as their rulers, but the Palestine area, Britain directly governed it, and this was the territory which was called Palestine then. So even if there wasn't a country of Palestine before 1918, it was part of the Ottoman state. Actually, it was called Palestine from that moment onwards. Same people lived there. And what this shows...
Right, so Abdullah, I just wanted to emphasize this point, because one, as you mentioned, one of the Zionist lies is to say there was no Palestinian state.
Yeah.
And it's a technicality that they're trying to use to obfuscate the fact that there were people there. They lived there.
Yeah.
The vast majority of the people that were living on that land were Palestinians, mainly Muslims, but there were Jews and Christians as well. And so that green doesn't represent, or the yellow doesn't represent a state. It represents people, doesn't it? That's the thing.
It does. It represents villages and farms and cities and a great history of a very dignified people in that region. And prior to 1917, it was Ottoman. And after 1917, it came under the British until 1946, 1947. You can see these three slides are effectively going between 1946 and 1949, right? And something very dramatic is changing in that time. The green enclaves are the areas which were given over to the Zionist people. And you can see what's happened between 46 and 47. 46, this is the areas which under British mandate Palestine, the Jewish people were given. The UN proposed this third map here, which frankly, apart from the shocking amount of green that they've suddenly given and taken away from the Palestinian people, apart from that, it's a crazy idea and a plan set up to fail that you could have a state of like this yellow one and this green one. That is a classic divide and rule type of tactic that the colonialists have used all around the world, which leaves a mess in place, to produce war and conflict. The next slide, the next picture represents what happened after the first clashes between the Arabs and the Zionists, and subsequently over the years, as we will see in our tragic story, more and more of the land which was once Palestine for the Palestinian people has been taken away and shrunk. This small yellow strip in the last few slides is Gaza, where all our attention and prayers are today. And this Balkanized area here, which looks like an archipelago, you know, those islands in the seas that are all like scattered around and broken up, is what's called the West Bank. And that doesn't even actually have cohesiveness to it anyway. So this is just an overview, just to remind us where we're at. Ilan Pape is a professor. He lives in the Zionist occupation. He teaches there. He's one of an unusual one of the unusual, very honest and just voices about history, who wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And he describes it as a very deliberate thing. So this is not something that there's been conflict for the last 75 to 100 years and it's produced a demographic change. No. According to Ilan Pappé, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was a systematic and comprehensive process that he says began in 1948 and continues to today. And it's a continuation of a process of colonization that began in the late 19th century. So there's a process of colonization that started at the end of the 1800s, and there's an actual active process of ethnic cleansing from 1948 onwards. So 1948 is the year that everything changed. The British Mandate ended. The Zionists declared their state they called Israel, which is really an occupation. That was the year. So before that, there was a process of colonization. And after that, he says there's a process of ethnic cleansing. And I chose this quote. Why? Because when you guys see today this idea that 1 million Palestinians have to move from the north of the Gaza Strip to the south, you need to view that in the context of this ethnic cleansing. For me, that is just ethnic cleansing of Gaza, a continuation of what's happened in the last 75 years. No question about it. Nothing to do with a warning, nothing to do with the war. It's become an excuse just to shift those people out of that area with an intention of taking it over in the long run. So I talked about why this has happened. And I said, look, there are two overlapping agendas, Zionism and colonialism. And we're going to describe really how this applies to Palestine. So Zionism is a political philosophy, right? So brothers and sisters, this is politics. This is not religion. Trust me, if you didn't know, and most of you will know, I'm sure, this is not about Jews and Muslims. This is about political philosophy by secular people, secular Jews, who actually were not very religious in Europe, who had this idea of a Jewish homeland for the Jewish diaspora. So obviously Jews, Bani Israel, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala settled them in the Holy Land many, many years ago. And from a religious perspective, we believe that through various disobedience to Allah and the prophets that Allah sent, they were scattered from that land as a punishment. And actually, the Jews believe that themselves religiously. They believe they live in a diaspora. They live scattered around the world. As one rabbi once told me, to live in exile in humility for errors that they made. Historically, effectively, when they lived there, you had invasions from outside. Most, in the end, the last most dramatic being by the Romans, which effectively eradicated a Jewish presence from Palestine and the Holy Land in any great numbers. And actually, Jews really only started coming back during the time that the Muslims opened that land after the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab. So they were expelled. They're living many, many parts of the world. Many of them were living in the Khilafah, in the Muslim lands, in Iraq, in Syria, in Morocco, many parts of the Muslim world, settled Jewish communities in Andalusia, under Islam in Spain. But many were living in Europe and Britain and Eastern Europe and Russia as well. So they were scattered around. So the Zionism was a political project started in the late 1800s, about 1880s. And these are two of the key figures. The one on the left is Theodor Herzl, who was the founder of this movement. He was a journalist in Vienna. And the one on the right is Chaim Weizmann. Herzl is really the father of this movement. And in the 1880s, he started it. He held the first World Zionist Congress in, I think, Switzerland in 1897. And he died in the early 20th century. Weizmann, the guy on the right, is the guy who effectively lobbied most effectively to get what was later called the Balfour Declaration, which we'll talk about. This is a really important slide. It's quite busy, and I'll talk you through it, but it kind of gives you some background as to why Jews like Herzl wanted a homeland somewhere. All right. And by the way, Palestine was not their only option. All right. Herzl himself, in the early 1900s, came to Britain, and he found people listening to him here. And one famous British politician, I think Joseph Chamberlain, who was, I think, a former prime minister, offered him an area of Uganda. Okay. And later on, there was an offer of land in it's called Andinia, which is in Argentina, in that area. Okay, so he was open, the Zionist movement was open to a homeland somewhere, but Palestine was their preferred choice. All right. This is about the persecution of Jews in Europe, and this is way before World War II, sorry. All right.
So just really quickly, Abdul Wahid, sorry, just to forgive me, but I just wanted to make this point because some people think, well, because I used to think this, I thought, why would they, Uganda and South America, why would these be options? But it's what you mentioned at the beginning, because you said that they were scattered. They believed, their religious beliefs, Jews believed that they were scattered. They weren't allowed to return back to Palestine, or Israel as they like to call it, because it was forbidden for them to establish a land there. So that's why they were open to other lands and other areas.
Absolutely. And bear in mind, these guys are not religious. Herzl and Weizmann were really not religious people. But this is a group of very ultra-Orthodox religious Jews who, to this day, believe it is a huge heresy and sin in their religion to politically manipulate a migration back to Palestine. Right? In their religious belief, they will only go back to Palestine when Allah decrees it, when God decrees it. Because, one of the doctrinal errors of Judaism is that they rejected Isa alayhi salam as the Masih, as the Messiah. All right. So their belief is that they're still waiting for a Messiah, and their trip back to Palestine will happen when their Messiah comes. Okay. So they are this group of Jews actually believes it's wrong for there to be a quote unquote state of Israel. They believe it's wrong. They believe it's a sin. Okay. And actually, their view was dominant amongst religious Jews right up until 1948. Right up until actually World War II and the increase in persecution of Jews in World War II. But we're talking about World War I and before World War I. So at the bottom left-hand corner, you have images of Jewish refugees who were victims of pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. So they were like literally mobs would come and drive them out and persecute them. So they would flee from Eastern Europe to Western Europe to try and find refuge. The image at the top, you can't see it, but it says the Alien Act of 1905. The Aliens Act was a law passed in Britain, all right, not by Nigel Farage, not by Suella Braverman, but by none other than Arthur Balfour, who was once a British Prime Minister. And in 1905, he passed this law, his government passed this law, which was trying to restrict Jews coming from Europe who had been persecuted, trying to stop mass migration of Jews coming into the UK. Some things in the UK don't change, do they, very much? Okay. There's a book title here, The Alien Jew in the British Imagination between 1881 and 1905. So really topical book, yeah? Not written by Douglas Murray or anyone like that, written by somebody else, right? You've got up here a public demonstration the British Brothers League, which is concerned about the further immigration of destitute foreigners, 1902, okay? So that's the climate in the UK, pretty hostile to Jews who are being treated even more hostile in Eastern Europe. And then you've got, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a very, very famous incident in France called the Dreyfus case. Now, this is a French soldier who was accused of spying for the Germans. Okay, so France, Germany, hostile to each other, and Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, he's a soldier in the French army, and he's accused of spying for the Germans, and he's got a very public, humiliating dressing down when he's found guilty, and a lot of it is associated with the fact that he's a Jew, and the fact that he is not to be trusted, and the fact that he is not really properly French and not really loyal. And in truth, over a series of years and some investigations by some other French soldiers, effectively they uncovered that they'd got the wrong man, and the senior French command knew that it was the wrong man even when they convicted him. And even when it was brought to their attention that there had been a mistrial, they covered it up, mainly because of his Judaism. And if you look at the British media this week about Muslims, about Palestinians, about that kind of media stuff, imagine that in the early part of the 1900s in France about Jews. Anyone who supported Dreyfus was considered to be like a traitor and either a Jew or a Jew lover. That's the kind of language they would use, right? But after some years, it came out very publicly that Dreyfus was an innocent man. He'd been sent to this French penal colony called Devil's Island, and really badly, like quite a Guantanamo type scenario. When he came back, people were shocked at how physically changed he was and stuff. He was exonerated, but the case had shockwaves around Europe at that time. Okay, so this is the kind of like climate in Europe that these guys were kind of thinking, okay, you know what, we want a homeland. So that kind of explains some of the psyche to you of why Zionists want a secure homeland, and why maybe so many Jewish people who support the Zionist occupation of Palestine kind of think that if they didn't have somewhere safe to go, they'd be in trouble. But it was by no means just for Palestine that they were after. It was a homeland. Like I say, it really isn't religious. So there are Jews who are not Zionists, and there are many Zionists, in fact, particularly in America, who are Christian Zionists or neocon Zionists, political Zionists, who are not even Jews, right? They support a Jewish homeland in Palestine, all right, even though they're not Jewish. So this is a political problem, not a religious problem. Herzl in 1896 went to the Ottoman Khalifa, the Ottoman Caliph Sultan Abdulhamid, okay? And at that stage in the life of the Khilafah, they were in huge debt. And Herzl had many contacts amongst great Jewish financiers and backers. And he went to the Sultan and he basically offered him money to buy land in Palestine so that Jews could come there and settle. All right. And this was the famous response from Sultan Abdulhamid: I will not sell a single inch of the country because it's not mine. It belongs to all the Muslims. They paid for this with their blood, and we will redeem it with our blood. Let the Jews keep their millions. If the Khilafah is partitioned, they will get Palestine for free, but that will happen over our dead bodies. He understood this is not his land to surrender. Okay. Actually, the Ottomans, they did allow Jewish migration from Europe to the Ottoman state. Most famously, after the fall of Andalusia and the Umayyad Sultanate in Andalusia in 1492, when Granada fell. Most famously, the Jews and Muslims who they were given three choices, weren't they? They could either die or convert or migrate, right? And those that left, they came to the Khilafah, and the Khalifa at the time, he said, Europe's loss is the Muslim world's gain, and he gave the Jews refuge then. But even right up until the 1800s, 1900s, the Ottoman Khalifas, they allowed Jews to come. Abdulhamid was very politically astute. He did not believe it was right to have a concentration of one group of migrants into one area. He knew that political dynamic would be dangerous. So whilst he allowed migration, he advised that these people should be settling in different places.
Yeah, I think some people they argue, isn't it, or they state that Sultan Abdulhamid II was aware of the political designs that they had for Palestine, and so it wasn't just a simple transaction they were asking for to buy some land, even if the land was uninhabited. Certain aspects of the land was uninhabited, maybe. But the issue was that he was aware that they wanted to change the demographics of the land in order to justify a creation of their own state within the heart of the Muslim Ummah.
Absolutely. So he whilst he, as a statesman and as the representative of the Muslims, who are the best ummah, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. You enjoin good and you forbid evil. Well, when we had a Khalifa, the Khalifa's job was to enjoin good and forbid evil on the world stage. And if there's a population of people who are being persecuted in one part of the world, you can understand the motivation of trying to help them and give them some refuge. At the same time, he's very politically astute. He is aware that by this stage, Herzl and later Weizmann are going to Britain. In particular, they went to Britain, France, USA, many places, but actually by this stage, it's very clear they're going to Britain as well as coming to visit him. So they are lobbying in Britain, and their voice is being heard here. I put here, right, that they knew what they wanted. They wanted a land for themselves, which they ruled, ideally in Palestine. Some were pragmatic. They were willing to do deals with the British or the French or whoever they would have a deal with, gradualists, you can say. And some became quite radical. They didn't want to be anyone's puppet, right? So some were willing to say to the British, yeah, we'll just settle us in Palestine, and of course we will be cooperative with you, as a stepping stone to getting what they wanted. And some were like, no, we want it, that's our right, and quite radical about it. And we'll see this play out later on. And by the way, that reality plays out today when they talk about within quote unquote Israel, so-called Israel today, the political left and right, left wing and right wing. They're all Zionists. They all want the whole land. They don't want to be anyone's colonial puppet. But some of them are much more radical about it than others. Some are more linked to play ball and give and take with their Western backers. So that is the first force that is trying to get their foot in the door in Palestine. And the second force, which is, as I say, overlapping, synergistic, but also come into conflict with it at some points, is the colonialists. And we're going to talk about that now. Yeah, is that okay? We move on?
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
So this is the same Balfour that we talked about, who signed this Alien Act in 1905, when he was Prime Minister, which was trying to stop persecuted Jews from Eastern Europe coming to Britain. Not a very nice man.
So he was an anti-Semite.
So I think he was an anti-Semite. But I've actually met people who are related to his extended family, because Balfour was from, there's a very famous family in Britain called the Cecil family. Yeah, Cecil. Okay. His ancestor was Queen Elizabeth I's main chief advisor. Okay. And ever since that time, the Cecil families have been kind of like linked intimately with British politics. And there are many Cecils who've been prime ministers of Britain over the years, or senior people. So Balfour was from the Cecil family. I've met somebody who's a journalist, actually, who's from that family. And he says in their family, they all debate whether or not he was an anti-Semite or not. Most of them say they don't think he was, yeah. But I have to say to him, I mean, look, he's like, if you understand what happens here, you'll realize that I think this guy pretty much was an anti-Semite, to be honest with you. He's trying to stop persecuted Jews from migrating to Britain, coming in as refugees in 1905. In 1917, he's foreign minister. It's World War I. David Lloyd George is prime minister. He's a Christian evangelist, by the way. He hates Muslims and Turks, Lloyd George, okay? Mark Sykes, Sir Mark Sykes of Sykes-Picot, which we'll talk about later, is a Foreign Office diplomat. Balfour is Foreign Secretary. And Weizmann has really had a good relationship with Sykes. And Sykes has sold Weizmann's vision to the rest of the cabinet. And by 1917, Britain is not doing as well as it thought it would in the war. Okay, when they went into World War II in 1914, they thought it would be a done deal in about a year. They all thought the Ottomans would be finished in about 6 months. And 3 years later, they're in a stalemate, both in Europe and in the East with the Ottomans. And by 1917, Britain's allies in the war are who? They're France and Russia. What happened in 1917 in Russia, Sharif?
Communist revolution.
Communist revolution, yeah, the Bolshevik revolution. So you suddenly got a change of government. Middle way through this war, you got a change of government in Russia, right? And so Britain is, by this stage, not confident that it can win the war. And it's got some backroom discussions happening with the Ottomans about how maybe they can have a ceasefire. And at the same time, it's promising the Zionists a homeland in Palestine. And in the hope of these British politicians was the Zionists will win American support to enter into the war. Okay, this is their hope. Their hope is if they promise the Zionists Palestine, the Zionists will use their influence to win America into the war. Now, this is actually, if you ask people today, if you say, oh, Jews control the world, Jews are all powerful, Jewish financiers, they have influence over politicians, they'll say that's anti-Semitic, right? But that was genuinely the belief of these British cabinet ministers. They believed that the wealthy Jews controlled everything and they would be able to influence the Americans. Okay, so that was actually their belief. So this is another anti-Semitic mark against Rothschild, against Balfour. So we'll just quickly read this, just in case anyone doesn't know it. Yeah, it's addressed to Lord Rothschild, 1917. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. And this is the statement. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I'll be grateful if you bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Okay. He's promised somebody else's land to a people that don't live there, to a third party, effectively. He promised something which wasn't his to give to a third party. He acknowledges in this there are people living there because he says that nothing should be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So he acknowledges there are people there, but he's promising that as a homeland.
And part of the, so just otherwise, and part of the reason for this is they're trying, according to what you're saying, is they're trying to curry favor from the Americans, because if they're going to give a homeland to the Jews, the Americans might come on the side of Britain and France, because at that time they weren't involved in the First World War.
They
Came
were
in
not involved in the First World
1917.
War. That's right.
Yeah, so they came
and the
in.
war
Yeah.
the war had been going on by this stage for 3 years. Like so many people had died. Yeah, it was just a bloodbath, and for no good reason. I mean, this was just like an imperial war where they're just fighting over land, influence, power. It's not. This is not any war of morality, basically. Which is they're not fighting for freedom, or they're not fighting for like because the other side is evil. The other side is the same as them, basically. All the same. All the same religion, all the same culture, all the same philosophy, all the same secular belief. The other side's the same as them. Even their royal families were related, basically. It's like not, no. The tragic picture on the right is just a few weeks after this, just a few weeks after the Balfour Declaration, is General Allenby entering into the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, because by this stage, Britain has managed to actually invade and take over Jerusalem for the first time since Salahuddin liberated it. An army of non-Muslims has come in and taken over Jerusalem. And that just happened in December 1917. All right. So just a few weeks later, it was so thick. I mean, sick meaning bad, sick, disgusting. Lloyd George, he said this was a Christmas present for the British people. Yeah, he was over the moon. It was like, we've got our revenge on Salahuddin. That was the kind of attitude that they had. Yeah, that they felt Jerusalem should be theirs. So all of that happened in World War I, 1914 to 1918. And it's really important to understand World War I, because the establishment of the occupation of Palestine started in 1917. So here's another lesson, Sharif. When people talk about 1948, that is not when Palestine was occupied. Palestine was occupied in 1917, right? I don't want to go back to 1948 borders. I want to go back to 1917, all right? That is, we as Muslims should be clear about that. This is started before the Zionist occupation began. This is a British colonial occupation by the Western powers in Palestine, starts in 1917, and it's part of a wider plan. It's part of a plan to occupy, divide up, and control the Middle East and destroy the Khilafah in the process. All right? You have to understand that Britain, the jewel in Britain's crown at this time was India. And the route to India was either through the Middle East by land, or it could be later on through the Suez Canal, going through Suez and the Red Sea and going around through the Indian Ocean. Nonetheless, it was crucial, and they really feared that a rising Germany or before that, even Napoleon went to Egypt, didn't he? And the British feared that he would end up in India. So their desire was to control this region for themselves. And over many years before World War I, they were involved in intrigues and sedition within the Ottomani Khilafah, and also trying to sow the seeds of rebellion in the Balkans and in East Europe and stuff. And World War I breaks out, and Sir Henry McMahon, who's a Foreign Office guy, he starts a correspondence with this man here, who is called Sharif Hussein. Sharif Hussein is the leader of he's the representative leader of the Ottoman Khalifa in Mecca. He's the governor of Mecca and Medina and that area of Hijaz. Okay, he had a very good relationship with Abdulhamid and the Ottomans, but actually had a very bad relationship with the Young Turks. So war's broken out. Britain's declared war on the Ottoman Khilafah. The Ottoman Khilafah is allied with Germany, and McMahon starts a correspondence with Sharif Hussein, promising him all sorts. And effectively, he wants him to become a rebel and revolt against the Ottoman Khilafah, opening up another front. So you've got the front in Europe, you've got a front in North Africa, you've got the Russians and the British actually actively fighting in Turkey. And what the British wanted was that Sharif Hussein in the Hijaz would start another front against the Ottomans, which would keep them occupied in that area. Okay. And that he did. He's such a crafty man that at one stage he was taking money from the Ottomans and the British at the same time, basically. And I think it might have been somebody else as well. I've forgotten who, but he was kind of like trying to get money all round. Okay. But he's the guy who allied with Lawrence of Arabia, famous, infamous Lawrence of Arabia. If anyone's seen the movie about the life of Lawrence, Sharif Hussein is the guy that he allied with. So he started the so-called Arab Revolt. And this is one of the other sickening things, that Arab nationalism, you know, it was a small entity at this time, but these guys made it into something more. It was all about anti-Turk kind of nationalism. So they were feeding off the anti-Turk sentiment and trying to create this fitna in Hijaz. So sadly, due to him weakening the Ottoman defenses, by 1917, the Ottomans lost Jerusalem, they lost Damascus, they lost Baghdad, and they lost Medina as well. They had Medina up till that point as well, and they lost Medina. And it was due to the treachery of this man. In secret, now Hussein, as well as being a traitor, was very politically gullible. Because the British convinced him that when the war's over, they'll make him the Khalifa, or they'll make him in charge of all these Arab lands. So he was expecting to be the ruler of Damascus and the ruler of Baghdad and the ruler of Jordan and Palestine and the whole of the Hijaz, right? He was expecting all of that. But actually, in secret, unbeknown to him, Britain and France had carved up the Middle East in 1916. They basically said, look, we'll take a line from roughly here. They said the C in the word acre to the L in the word Mosul. We'll draw a line, and roughly speaking, everything north of that line will be French, and everything south of that line after the war will be British. The British shifted that line quite a lot because there was quite a lot of oil in the north of Iraq in those days, they discovered. So they were very keen that they would take Mosul. They also, Palestine, you can see here in purple, was meant to be under international control, but the British managed to maneuver it so they would get that. And actually, after the war, initially British took over Syria and the French had to kind of like boot them out, basically. Okay. But they carved it up in 1917, unbeknown to Sharif Hussein. So the idea was, let's occupy the land in the war militarily. When we finish the war, we'll divide it up with these straight line borders, artificial borders. We'll call one country Syria, one Lebanon, one Palestine, one Jordan, one Iraq, and then Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And we'll call give them all these names. We'll put, excuse me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fine, alhamdulillah.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah?
Yeah, fine, yeah.
I'm talking so much my earpiece fell out. So they divided all up. They put their proxy rulers in, right? And they literally are proxy rulers. I mean, after the war, Sharif Hussein had 3 sons, and they gave one of them Iraq, one of them Jordan. Actually, they gave one of them, and one of them, let me get this right. They gave one of them
Syria, wasn't it?
Yeah, one Syria, but then the French weren't happy with him, so they booted him out and they gave him Iraq. And they gave one Egypt. They gave one Egypt, and they gave one Jordan. Okay, and Sharif Hussein wanted the Hijaz as well, but no, they gave that to the Al Saud family. All right, and in Syria and in Lebanon, the French put their own people in who they trusted as their agents and proxies in the region. Okay, so ever since that time till today, these lands have been divided, and we've never really had what you could call representative rule. It's all artificial divisions. They were once one land. They were once all Ottomans. They were once all Muslims. They were once all citizens of the Khilafah, even if they're non-Muslim. They were citizens of the Khilafah, right? And so this was plan number 2. And plan number 3 in the war was to weaken the Ottoman state so much that at the end of the war, they would be able to squeeze what was left and establish a secular nation state of Turkey, abolish the Khilafah, which happened in 1924, just 99 years ago, and weaken it so that it was no longer an influence. And in fact, in the treaties, post-World War I treaties, all these lands were signed away. The borders of Turkey were defined. Everything, it's tragic when you look at the treaties. Literally, all these lands, Turkey has to agree it's going to give all of them up, right? And the British are going to take some, and the French are going to take some. Palestine was given under a mandate to the British. Okay, so why did Britain want Palestine? Why did Britain want to do that to the Middle East? Well, one of their most senior diplomat was a guy called Nathaniel Curzon, Lord Curzon. He was a former viceroy of India and then later on a Foreign Office guy. He was their main negotiator in the Lausanne Conference. And he said in the House of Lords, it's about India. We want it for military and strategic objectives. So it's not about doing like something noble for the beleaguered Jews of Europe and giving them a homeland. Forget that. It's about their strategic objectives. And Sir Ronald Storrs, who was also a Foreign Office diplomat, who was later a Governor General of the British Mandate Palestine, he described what he wanted, what Britain wanted, was a little loyal Jewish Ulster. All right. Ulster is Northern Ireland. All right. And what did the British do in Northern Ireland? Ireland, predominantly Catholic. Britain's history between Protestants and Catholics, not good. A lot of conflict in trying to occupy Ireland in the time of Elizabeth I and then Cromwell and these kind of things. So what did the British do in Ulster? They took these really radical Protestants who were like from Scotland and shipped them into the north of Ireland so that they changed the demographic there. So that when it came to giving Ireland its independence from Britain, they could argue, the north is all Protestant, and they want to stay with England. They want to stay with Britain. So they managed to divide Ireland north and south like that. Okay, so Northern Ireland, Ulster, became a British colony, which was there to safeguard Britain from influence in Ireland. Okay, so what did Ronald Storrs say that they wanted in the Middle East? A little loyal Jewish Ulster. All right, they wanted their proxy colony in the Middle East. So the Zionists want Palestine as a homeland, and the colonialists want Palestine as their proxy colony. Up to a point, their interests overlap, but actually after a certain point, their interests are going to clash with each other. And in between this are people in Palestine. And in fact, that's just summarizing what I said. Actually, this is interesting. This is Curzon writing to Balfour in 1919, so just after the war. And he's writing to Balfour basically saying Weizmann, who's the leader of the World Zionist movement, the guy before I saw with a little beard, contemplated a Jewish state, a Jewish nation, a subordinate population of Arabs. And Weizmann's trying to effect this behind the screen and under the shelter of British trusteeship. Well, he's saying, that's not what we want. We want them to run our colony there. Yeah, we don't want them to have their own state and their own independence and their own vision and their own, dominate the Arabs. That's not the agenda. Actually,
So let me Abdul Wahid,
yeah,
let me just understand really quickly. So on the one hand, you had Lord Curzon talking about how India is really important, and all the sea routes and the trade
yeah,
routes and the land trade routes were going through the Middle East, going through the Arab land. So it was really important. Palestine and some of these areas were really important for that. And then obviously this was at the beginning or just before oil was really discovered within the Middle East. So
yeah,
they didn't really know
yes.
about oil at this time. So for them, it was India.
By the end of the war, they did. By the
Yeah,
end of the war, that it was very clear that they knew that in the north of Iraq, particularly, there was oil there, and they
yeah,
knew they had to push that where the French should have had Mosul and places like that. Britain pushed it so that they took that area because they knew the oil fields were there.
yeah.
Yeah,
And then on this quote that you've mentioned here, or the previous point as
yeah,
well, and relate to this, is that they wanted to create a Jewish loyal Jewish Ulster. Yeah, and so
colony,
just
basically colony. Yeah,
yeah, a
yeah,
colony, because I think just for the audience to be aware, the way Ireland is split between Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is part of Britain. It's not like
yeah.
separate from Britain. So
No,
when they're saying they want to create loyal Jewish Ulster, they want to create Palestine as being, in essence, a British protectorate.
British
Part of
protection.
Britain,
That's right.
not its own
That's right.
state initially. At least
That's
they
right.
didn't want to establish its
That's
own
right.
state. And obviously, with regards to Ulster, as you mentioned, just to re-emphasize the point, they forcefully changed the demographic of Northern Ireland to bring in loyal British Protestants to then change the demographic away from the Catholic Irish. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that
And this is important for, we will see in the subsequent slides, the British did that in Palestine, and they did, so they were using the same tactics in Palestine. And their desire, their aim was to have their own satellite colony there, right? Which would be loyal to Britain. And what Curzon is basically saying to Balfour, well, look, this guy's getting too big for his boots, basically. Yeah. This guy is not got the same agenda as us. And this is important to understand because all of this plays out till today. Those of you guys who watch this region, and you will have seen that just before this conflict broke out in the last week, there's a lot of talk about how Biden wasn't even talking to Netanyahu, right? Biden and Netanyahu had virtually no dialogue for months or years. Why? Because Biden, in today's day and age, Britain is no longer the global power. Britain's a small player. America is the big power. America wants their own loyal little Ulster, right? They want their colony there. Well, Netanyahu and his guys these days, they want their own state. They don't want to be anyone's puppet. They don't even want two states. They want just the whole of Palestine and a bit of Jordan to boot, yeah, to be what they call Eretz Israel, right? A greater Israel. That's what they want, right? And actually, still, the Americans want there to be two states so that they have their colony there and to keep them in check. So that conflict continues till today, yeah. And actually, what you can see, that conflict playing out right till today. And in fact, the balance is, often the tension is there and it's swinging back and forth. Now they've all made up and they're friends again. What you can see is that this new government of national unity, which they've brought in to fight the Muslims in Gaza, actually a lot of them are the type who will more likely play ball with their sponsoring power, the United States. Okay, they're more likely to play ball, whereas the old government, Netanyahu, and these really extreme guys, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, yeah, they don't really care what the Americans think. Frankly, they just want to do their own thing. Yeah, so the pendulum slightly swung back, but this tension goes back to this era. Okay, so wars ended. Britain is given a mandate over Palestine by the League of Nations. So they're told, there's a new country called Syria, there's a new country called Jordan or Transjordan, new country called Lebanon. And by the way, this thing called Palestine, it's going to be run by the British, according to the League of Nations after World War I. And this is a really important slide. So remember what we said about Ulster, that they shipped in all these Protestants into the north of Ireland to change the demographic. Have a look at this, guys. 2 key dates, all right? Jewish population of Palestine in 1882, 24,000 people, all right? Goes up a bit in 1914 because by this stage, Sultan Abdulhamid, the Ottomans after him, the Young Turks, they've allowed Jews to come and settle in Palestine, all right? Because they've been giving them a home because they're persecuted in Europe. So it's gone from 24,000 to 94,000. Somehow, by the end of the war, 1918, it's gone down to 60,000. Okay, so 1918, war has ended. Britain has taken over. Britain has taken over the League of Nations mandate over Palestine in 1918 with 60,000 people, right? Their mandate ends in 1948, by which time there is 716,000 Jewish people who have been shipped in from Europe over that 30-year period, okay? That has, in this very small area called Palestine, they've changed the demographic deliberately to create their colony that they wanted, okay? That's been their attempt. And it's created fitna. Man, before this time, Muslims and Jews and Christians did not have a problem rubbing along together in this land of Palestine, right? They got on culturally, they weren't hugely different. They dressed the similar way, their eating habits, their food styles, they kind of, got along. They just, they had their different areas within the cities where they lived. They worshipped differently, obviously. It was all under the umbrella of Islamic rule, but they got on. But in this 30-year period, the British have completely changed the demographic in there. And the local Palestinian population is feeling a threat. And these are Europeans. These are not the same cultural affinity to them. You go to the East, people have manners, they have hospitality. They're kind to each other. They get on with their neighbors. You've got some European guys coming in. Literally imagine some slightly more civilized football hooligans basically coming in, demanding their rights. They want what they want. They are a very different bunch of people. And some of them have been affected by this Zionist ideology in Europe, right? So they think they're coming in and they're coming to their land. They're not thinking they're coming in and being given shelter in somebody else's home. They're thinking that's their right. It's really creating tension in that land. So by the 1940s, you have quite a lot of conflict going on there between the newly imported Jewish migrants, the resident Arab population. And by the way, the resident Jews who had been there for years really didn't welcome this change in demographic at the time. They absolutely didn't. And the British colonial power, because everyone's against them. So you've got these clashes going on. Really bad, really bad thing. It's a terrible, terrible thing. So you've got the population changing from 8% to 82%. It's like, as if that's not enough. It's very depressing, to be honest with you. When you read, as if that's not enough, the British in charge of Mandate Palestine are allowing the Jews to organize politically. So there is this thing called the Jewish Agency, right? Which is it's basically a legacy of the Zionist Federation, and they are allowed to organize the Jewish community, the Jewish population, there politically between 1935 and 1948. Okay. And David Ben-Gurion was the chairman of that executive for that period. And Churchill says in Lord George says to Churchill in 1922, we must not allow such a thing as a representative government to happen in Palestine. So no way are the Palestinians going to be allowed to organize politically. And Martin Gilbert, who is a very famous British historian, who is, I think he is of Jewish background, but he's a very famous British historian. From British historians' perspective, he's said to be an authority on this. He actually says the centerpiece of British policy, that Britain would withhold representative institutions to Palestine as long as there was an Arab majority. So change the demographic, get a Jewish majority, and then, we'll allow you to have this wonderful democratic society in the Middle East, a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. We've just rigged it. We've created a colony, and then we'll not allow the Arabs to organize and politically. And then their idea was that they would have one state. Actually, at this stage, the British believed in one state, but it would be majority Jewish, so therefore it would be loyal to them, and the Arabs would be a second-class minority. Really depressing. And frankly, they really didn't care about the injustice of this. Okay, this is Winston Churchill addressing the Peel Commission that actually had an idea of a one-state solution for Palestine. And he actually said, I don't admit, this is terrible language from Churchill, I don't admit that the dog in the manger, a reference to the Palestinian people, has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I don't admit for an instance that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America, meaning the Native American people, or the Black people of Australia, meaning the Aboriginal people, the Native Australian people, both of whom are wiped out, basically, in terms of their numbers by the colonial invaders. I don't think the Red Indians had any right to say the American continent belongs to us and we're not going to have any of these European settlers coming here. They had not the right, nor had they the power. Okay, so this is basically Britain's thinking in the 1930s, and they're applying that to the Palestinians. I said that in Palestine in those days, there was a lot of conflict. So you've got these European Jews coming in. The British have this vision of one state, and they want to do it their way, right? They want one state. They want the Jews to be loyal to Britain. They want the Jews to be the majority. They want the Arabs not to organize. And that's their vision. By this stage, you've got loads of European Jews who are just not happy with that. And as well as being clashes between them and the Palestinians, you have these Jewish migrants there, Zionist migrants, organizing militarily. The first military group they had is called the Haganah, right? They organize themselves militarily. They do attacks on the Palestinians. They do attacks on the British. The Haganah had different factions in. Some were more extreme than others. So one faction called Irgun broke off because they thought that the Haganah was too soft, too willing to let off some of these people. They were more radical. They wanted to attack more Palestinians and more British, right? Irgun were responsible, I think I'm right in saying Irgun. There was a more extreme version called Lehi, or the Stern Gang, that broke off from Irgun, right? The Haganah, they broke off the extreme wing called Irgun, broke off an extreme wing called Lehi, or the Stern Gang. The Stern Gang, really weird, considering that they're Jewish Zionists who come from Europe, yeah? They had some good relations with Nazis in Europe, okay? They really, like, strange dynamic going on here, but they kind of agreed with the kind of nationalist philosophy. And it was, I think, Irgun that did this. This is the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, where the British troops used to stay. And effectively, Irgun blew it up, all right? Now, this is the 1940s, 1946, I think it was. That's a pretty big explosion for 1946 for a terrorist group. So they're getting their supplies from somewhere, and they killed dozens of British officers in that, okay? The leader of Irgun was this man, Menachem Begin, the founder of the Likud party, and later a prime minister of Israel. Likud is the party which Netanyahu is the leader of at the moment. So these Zionist militias and terrorist groups morphed into today's politicians, okay? And they really are. Yitzhak Shamir, who was a former prime minister of the Zionist occupation called Israel, was a member of the Stern Gang of Lehi, all right? So these guys were the radical wing. They're uncompromising, which is why you see nowadays they're pretty uncompromising in the way they deal with anyone, yeah, in terms of what they want is greater Israel. So again,
just on that point, just really quickly, so Abdullah, just so on that point, so these organizations that were undertaking military actions against the British, they were termed terrorists, weren't they?
Oh yeah, 100%. And all this stuff about we don't talk to terrorists, it went out the window when in the end these guys became politicians, basically.
Right.
I mean, Begin has British blood of British soldiers on his hands. They would host him here as head of state, no problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's like basically Israel today or Zionists today talking about Hamas and then inviting them for a state dinner.
Absolutely. But it kind of, I think what this really shows, this period of British Mandate rule shows that there is this colonial project and there is this Zionist project. And at some point it's come to loggerheads in this game. So Britain is sick to death of this, by the way, by this stage. By the mid-1940s, they really are like having a headache with this because they're hated by the Arabs. They're hated by the Jews. The Jews and Arabs hate each other. The Arab resistance is, there are two very famous leaders in Palestine whose names were very famous. And in fact, one is Hajj Amin Husseini, who was an Islamic scholar there. The West portrays him as an anti-Semite. And the reason they do this is because Hajj Amin Husseini, he felt that these European Jews, Zionists, coming in to take over the land were a threat. So he would encourage any pushback and resistance against that. The other leader there was Izzeddin Qassam. Okay, Izzeddin Qassam is now famous because of the Qassam brigades of Hamas, who have been in the news recently. Izzeddin Qassam was an Islamic scholar from Syria, and actually Izzeddin Qassam was far more far-sighted. That he knew that these Zionist Jews from Europe were just the proxies. That behind it was a colonial power. So actually he would vent his anger towards the colonial power and actually encouraged the people of Palestine to resist the colonial power, not to focus on the Zionist Jews who were just being pushed there. I say, you know, Britain is willing to fight, and America these days is willing to fight to the last Zionist Jew to defend their colony in the region. Yeah, they're happy for these peoples to suffer, to serve their interests. They don't care about them, frankly. And Qassam, he understood that, I think, more than Hosseini did. So Qassam vented anger more towards the British, whereas Hosseini seemed to vent anger more towards the Zionist migrants who'd come. But mid-1940s, Britain is sick to death of it. The mandate is due to expire by 1949. So the British Parliament sets a date of the 15th of May, 1948, as the point at which the mandate expires. And they're going to hand it over to the UN. Now, for those of you who don't know, the UN didn't exist before World War II. So 1939 to 1945, there is no UN, no United Nations. After World War II, there is the United Nations. And in 1947, this hand grenade is handed over to the UN, where they design a partition plan, right? Where the green areas are the Jewish state and the orange areas are the Arab state, and Jerusalem is an international city. And I mean, what a mess. Yeah, this is just unworkable, all right? But this is what the UN agreed to in November 1947. So November 1947, Britain's mandate is going to end by May 1948, so just 7 months down the line. They've changed the demographic of Palestine by then so that 80% of the population are Jews. They've allowed the Jews to organize politically. They've actually allowed them to organize militarily as well by this stage. So everything is primed for a problem to come. So these are the dates. Okay. Britain's mandate is due to expire 15th of May. One day before, the Zionists unilaterally declare themselves as a state. The same day, the United States recognizes them, and that's been prepared beforehand. So Ben Gurion, who's this man, who, and by the way, none of these people, Ben Gurion, Begin, Shamir, none of these people were ever born in that region. Not a single one was born in what is today called Palestine, or what they call Israel. Yeah, they're all from Europe, Eastern Europe mostly. None of them are indigenous to the region at all. Okay, so Ben Gurion, he's been to the States, he's spoken to Harry Truman, the US president. Truman has made some calculations. He's recognized this new state, this occupation, he's recognized it as a new state. 3 days later, just 3 days later, the Soviet Union recognizes them as an official state. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about this when I was preparing this, thinking, wow, that's strange, isn't it? You know, America and the Soviet Union hated each other, but they were allies in the war. So, and then it occurred to me that both America and the Soviet Union hated Britain and France's colonial kind of rule of the world. So I can quite see, and they did this after the war. Many of your audience may be aware of this if you like history. But actually, there was a point at which America and the Soviet Union kind of decided that, you know, we can defer our conflict with each other for a little while, but why don't we kind of go to the places where Britain or France have colonial influence, and we wrestle the colonial influence away from them. So the communists went over to some countries, many in Africa, and they said, hey, why do you want to have France ruling over you? Why don't you have independence and become a communist state? And the Americans helped many former colonies of Britain and France to rebel against Britain and France over the subsequent kind of over the couple of decades post-war. So that might kind of make sense to me as to why the US and the Soviet Union recognized this new entity very quickly, even though Britain didn't immediately. And it was almost a year before the United Nations formally admitted them. And in that year, there was war, there was conflict, as we're going to see. Why is this important? Because these guys never had any legitimacy. They were illegitimate from day one. And since that time, they've been trying to buy legitimacy. All right. So they declare themselves as a state in somebody else's land. And the US backs them for its own vested interests. The Soviet Union backs them for their own vested interests. The UN is only convinced to admit them and recognize them as an official state a year later. And the Arab countries and the Muslim world didn't recognize them at all. And slowly over the subsequent decades, 1, then 2, then 3, then 5, then 6 countries are recognizing them. They are still struggling with being seen as being legitimate 75 years later. Yeah. And that's a really important thing for us to remember. They are not. You might have noticed I don't use the word Israel very often, because I say so-called Israel because I don't view it as a state. It's not actually a state. It is an occupation, which is a pseudo-state. It is a military occupation which calls itself a state, and I don't want to dignify it with the word of being a state. That's as simple as that. Yeah. So this is an important fact. 1948 happens, and we have what is called a Nakba, a catastrophe. And this is tragic. This is literally these Zionist militias, they turn their guns on the Palestinians. And in the 1 year that followed the 15th of May 1948, between 750,000 and 900,000 Palestinian men, women, and children were driven out of their homeland. What we are seeing of 1 million people in Gaza being shifted away has happened before. 500 villages were depopulated and demolished. All right, this is what we call a Nakba in this 1 year period. Haaretz, which is a Zionist newspaper, they say most historians today, Zionists, post-Zionists, and non-Zionists, agree that at least 120 of the 530 villages, the Palestinian inhabitants were expelled by Jewish militias and military forces. So literally, people were driven out of their homes. They went to what is now the West Bank, or what is now Gaza, or eventually they ended up in Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Syria, Iraq, always to this day, unfortunately, as second-class citizens, because even though they're Muslim, even though they're Arab, even though they're born in those countries, the nation states that were divided up by the colonialists after the war never sees them as their own people.
And just as a point as well, this is really important because, again, it explodes this myth that the Zionists or the Jews came, they simply bought up the land. It was a fair transaction between the Palestinian people and these Zionists. And so, what's Muslims got a problem with? What the Palestinians got a problem with? But even their own newspaper says most historians agree that villages were being wiped out or being, the villagers were being expelled from this, up to, like you said, 900,000. And obviously we're talking about a very lower population compared to today in terms of not just that region,
absolutely,
but world population. So 1 million people being, removed from a particular area is a huge number, in comparison. So, people need to be aware that this point explodes this myth that it was just, these Zionists coming in, buying up land, and that was the reason why they were able to populate this area. It was because they removed the villages. They removed the indigenous population from this area.
There's a very nasty streak. I mean, there's a really very nasty streak to these people as well. Many of you will have heard of this place, Deir Yassin, was a village in Palestine. And the Zionists deliberately picked this village to inflict such horrific atrocities on the people that the rumor would spread around Palestine, so that when they came to other places, people wouldn't want to stay. They wouldn't want to stay to see their men killed, their women dishonored and killed, and mutilation of bodies. Right? We've heard the fake news in the last week about the beheaded babies, right? No evidence has been brought into the public domain about beheaded babies. Well, I can understand why that's in the imagination of these people because of what they committed in Deir Yassin in the past, right? They targeted this village. They went in as a crack squad to create as much mayhem and a ripple effect across the whole Palestine, so that there was followed by many Arabs fleeing their localities in the future just because of this, basically. There were like 25 survivors taken to Jerusalem as trophies and then killed there, executed there, basically. There is no Deir Yassin today. If you look on a map, you won't find it there. This is a letter from a Stern Gang operative, a Lehi operative, who said literally house by house, we were putting explosives in and they're running away, an explosion and move on, explosion and move on. And within a few hours, half the village isn't there anymore. Yeah. To me, it looked a bit like a pogrom. I mean, when you hear that and you know that this land was occupied by people like this, you'll understand why it makes us as Muslims so angry that it's as if the Western media and Western politicians want to portray to their population that atrocities in that region just started a week ago. Yeah. From 1948 onwards, this is what the Muslims and Christian Arabs in Palestine have been living with. Okay. And so, put it in perspective, guys. This is if I say this, if there were atrocities done by Muslims last week, genuine atrocities that go beyond what is acceptable in resistance, right? We as Muslims wouldn't agree with that because our loyalty is to Allah and His Messenger and the Sharia of Allah, right? But worse than that, even if that were true and proven, worse than that is what the Palestinians have suffered in the last 75 years by multiple times over. So you'll excuse me if I don't listen with patience to what people are saying these days about what's happening in Gaza. I mean, these are just more accounts about what happened. People tied to a tree and set on fire. People just blasted with a Tommy gun. Two Arab girls of 16 or 17 put against a wall. I stood them. This is from people that were there. I stood them, 2 Arab girls of 16, 17, against the wall and blasted them with 2 rounds from a Tommy gun. Old woman and an old man shot in the back. They just piled up their bodies and burned them. And the impact goes on today, basically. This is a Zionist from today who argues there is justification for killing babies if it's clear that they'll grow up to harm us. That's their philosophy of these people, right? That's the kind of thing. And this is a opinion column in Haaretz written by a Jewish writer in Israel who basically says, killing children brings the Israelis together. And you see that. What's uniting them today is this attack. But more than that, it's the revenge, the bloodlust that's going on for revenge in Gaza at the moment, which is allowing their politicians to effectively ethnically cleanse, right? It gives license to them to do what they want. And this is, as I say, this is kind of, this is the language of today, basically. So the Israeli president says there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. These are banners on the road in Tel Aviv. Genocide Gaza. Victory is 0 people in Gaza. Yeah, these are the kind of headlines that are there. And this is a still from a video where they're celebrating and joking. Gaza's going to be a cemetery, basically. So, okay. 1948 happens. They declare 14th of May, they declare their own state, right? The Palestinians have nothing. They're being attacked in this way I'm describing, which Deir Yassin happened before the declaration, but it's a similar type of attack happening by these militias, driving people out of their villages. Strategic attacks to get more land. By the way, there's a very good, if you've got iPlayer, there is a interesting series of documentaries called Holy Land Stories on iPlayer. It is worth watching in this context. They basically take people of Palestinian origin living in Britain and people of Jewish origin living in Britain, and they allow them to go and visit occupied Palestine and to retrace some things about their families. And, the BBC try and present it as really nice, even-handed stories, emotional stories, but you can't hide it. Even the way they present it, effectively, a lot of the Jewish families that are presenting there, their ancestors went there to fight, to kill, to depopulate Arab areas and settle there. And the Arab families that are going back there are going back to find their land is taken over, is lost. That they had family. They had one sister who goes there, and her family were from Deir Yassin. So, literally the lands are taken. It's very moving, actually. And I don't think it's meant to be presented in an even-handed way. And even when you do, I don't think anyone can watch it and feel that it's kind of in any way, shape or form even-handed. But what happens at that same time is the Arab countries surrounding are really unhappy because what they were promised by the British and the French before the war is not happened, right? They weren't expecting this. In fact, Jordan was expecting to have the whole of Palestine at one stage, okay? And And each of these countries, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, they have proxy rulers in there, the proxy colonies, and their armies are commanded by former British officers. Okay, so there is a war declared on this new state of Israel, supposedly, or a so-called state of Israel. The declared aims of this war, in the war, the declared aims in a statement, in the terms of reference of the war that were agreed between these powers beforehand, actually included disarming the Palestinians, disarming the Palestinian militias. Okay, and in that Holy Land Stories program, they go to a village with some Palestinian old men who had to evacuate that village when they were young, and they describe how the Jewish militias came and were trying to drive them out. And the men of the village did their best to defend. And then the soldiers came from Jordan, and they said to the Palestinian villagers, leave it to us, we will defend you. Yeah, take your family a few miles down the road into Jordan and wait there, and then you can come back. Give us your guns. Like literally, they'd give up their weapons, they'd go, and within days of that, effectively, they did their first ceasefire. So the official war is declared on the 15th of May, and by the 11th of June, it's the first ceasefire. So in that BBC documentary, Holy Land Stories, these old men are living in Jordan, and they were young men or children who were told, "Oh, you just be away for a few days and then come back." And they never got to come back to their village. Basically, never ever got to come back to their village. So this so-called war, effectively, it reminds me of with the Bosnians, isn't it? The UN went in there and on the pretext of protecting the Bosnians, but they said, lay down your weapons and we'll protect you. And then there was no protection for them.
So yeah. Let me understand this, because this is relatively new information for me as well. So you're saying that the Arab countries, and you just for people who've joined maybe midway or late, we discussed how the British and the French, the colonial powers during World War I, how they created these proxy states within the Arab countries. Yeah. But what you're saying, though, is that these Arab states that were created by the British and the French, they declared war against the state of Israel when it was first founded. And you're saying that one of their stated aims of the Arab countries was to disarm the Palestinians.
Yeah. And in fact, some of it was to disarm the militias that were linked to Hajj Amin Husseini in particular, but actually basically disarm them. I mean, they were all out in it for themselves. All right. These countries that they created, they had rulers in there. And this will not actually surprise our audience very much, right? They had rulers in there who relied on external powers to guide them, influence them, keep them in their positions of power, right? With money, with military support, with actually military officers guiding them, okay? But at the same time, they also wanted to look out for themselves and their own families and their own ruling elites. Yeah, so this is like not unusual. This is what we see in the Muslim world today, frankly, isn't it? Mm. So you can imagine that in the 1940s, where these states are less mature than they are now. So a country like Syria went through coup and counter coup, God knows how many times between 1918 at the end of World War I and the 1960s. It was constantly coup, counter.
Yeah.
So these are not stable states.
Yeah. But have you got a reference for that point that you mentioned, that one of their?
So I've got it's mentioned in a book I have written by Tariq Suwaidan, who's a Kuwaiti scholar, a book on Palestine, which unfortunately he doesn't reference that, but the references he would use would be in from Arab sources, I'm sure.
Okay.
But he has 3 points, and each one of the points is effectively about disarming the Palestinians. Yeah, and one of them is to disarm the guerrilla groups linked to Haj Amin Husseini, to disarm the population. And it's like, you know, the soldiers, the sincere soldiers who went in from Jordan or Syria, went in and said to the Palestinian people, we will defend you, right? Leave it to us, we will defend you. So I don't believe that the ordinary soldier on the ground went in thinking he's going to do anything except defend them. But their commanding officers, basically, they're the ones who determined when the ceasefire happened. And there was a ceasefire on the 11th of June, just less than a month after this war is officially declared. And then in that ceasefire period, the Zionists got more arms, more supports, and regrouped. They were not doing well initially. And in fact, the British officer assigned by Britain to assist the Jordanian king, Abdullah, who was the son of Sharif Hussein, the aforementioned guy who allied with Lawrence of Arabia that we talked about, right? His son, Abdullah, was the king of Jordan, the new king of Jordan. Jordan never had a king. There was no Jordan before, but he became king. He was given the assistance of a guy called John Bagot Glubb, who was a British officer, he was his leader of his army and a chief advisor. He got known as Glubb Pasha because he was so involved with the regime. It was almost like their chief minister. And he is quoted as saying, if the Arabs had allowed their forces to finish the job on the 15th of May, they would probably have annihilated the emerging state of Israel. But somewhere along the line, somebody has advised these Arab countries that they should have a ceasefire 3.5 weeks after they started this war to defend the Palestinians. Okay, in that time of another few weeks, the Zionists regrouped, rearmed. They had arms coming in from Europe, and fighting resumed. All right, which then continued till February the next year. In that time, those hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven out of their home. I mean, basically, this is the part of what happened in the Nakba. And they literally were sent to live in the areas which were, which the Zionists wanted. They were expelled from there. They ended up living in what is today's West Bank. There are refugee camps in places like Jenin and places like that in the West Bank. In the north of Gaza, where we're talking about at the moment, a lot of them are not indigenously from that locality. They're from other parts of Palestine. And then many ended up in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Kuwait.
Yeah, I think 70% of Gaza, 70% of the
yeah.
population of Gaza are actually refugees, internal refugees, effectively. They what they call the state of Israel now, that's where they're actually from, and they had to move.
And this is a synergistic moment between the Zionists and the colonialists, okay? Because the colonialists gave them backing, very much like they're giving backing to what's happening today, right? Literally, it's a synergistic moment. They're supposedly on the side of the Arabs, but actually they facilitated all the ceasefires and eventually what happens, okay? And this is why in my next section, I call them the Zionist Muslim rulers, okay? Because really, these people have been the people that have allowed the existence of this occupation to continue for 75 years. Sharif Hussein, we've already talked about, who started in his betrayal with his correspondence with Sir Henry McMahon during World War I. And then these are his sons, right? This is his family, basically. And they're various members of his family with British officers and other dignitaries of that region. This is his son Faisal ibn Sharif Hussein, on the right of this photograph, was originally given the kingdom of Syria and then later given the kingdom of Iraq. And there's a hilarious story about when he's given. I mean, this is a guy who's born and brought up in Mecca, basically in Hijaz, right? And there's a hilarious story about him when he becomes the king of Iraq, because he's taken in Iraq to be given allegiance by the leaders of tribes as a formal kind of ceremony to become king. And this British spy, Gertrude Bell, is friends with this guy, Faisal ibn Sharif Hussein. And the leaders of the tribes, they go up to him and they say, we pledge you allegiance as king of Iraq because you are the one who's most desired by the British. That was actually their pledge of allegiance to the guy, yeah? And Gertrude Bell writes in her memoir, Faisal looked confused about what the hell they were saying and a bit embarrassed. And then he looked at her looking for something, and she said, I just clasped hold of his hands and congratulated him. And then everyone sang God Save the King, basically. Yeah, it's a joke, yeah? That is how these countries were founded, yeah? The Kingdom of Iraq, which then later there was a military coup that then ousted these guys.
Yeah,
But
just
this
so
is
the audience are aware, isn't it? You had Lawrence of Arabia who saw towards the Hijaz area and nudged, and you had Gertrude Bell, a woman, who was
the
stationed
female
in
Lawrence.
Iraq, and
that's right.
She was dictating and directing the Arab tribes in this region on behalf of the British. Yeah, so just so the audience are aware.
This is a really really nasty thing, right? At the end of World War One, there was a conference there were two big conferences, the Sèvres conference and then later the Lausanne conference. But these were the conferences where the Europeans effectively carved up the Muslim world, and it led effectively to the dismantlement of the Khilafah as well. Okay. And Weitzman, this is Chaim Weitzman, the same guy with the little beard, with the Zionist guy who lobbied the British to do the Balfour Declaration.
Are you saying the one in the white suit?
He's the one in the white. So Weitzman is the one in the white.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, that's Weitzman. With him is his mate Faisal. Yeah, his mate Faisal. They're good friends by this stage. All right, both. One is lobbying the British and one is doing the dirty work for the British. Okay. And they're both invited to the conferences after the war, right? Weitzman, he's a nobody, and he's invited to this conference where they're dividing up, okay? And Weitzman and Sharif Hussein, and Faisal ibn Hussein, they basically are both asked to sign a document which allows the British to take over Palestine, and the Zionist organization will be kind of given a right to assist in the post-war period in that thing. And this is the document which is countersigned by Weitzman, right? And in Arabic, you can see Sharif Hussein's writing here. He couldn't actually read English, so this was translated for him. This is actually the handwriting of Lawrence. Yeah, Lawrence translated it for him, and then he signed it. So effectively, this guy, he's a nobody. He's a traitor to the Muslims, the son of a traitor to the Muslims, to the Ottoman Khilafah, and he's invited to this European conference about carving up, and he effectively signs over saying the Zionists are allowed a say in what happens in the future of the Middle East, right? This is the betrayal of these kind of people.
And just really quickly, because maybe some people have joined halfway through, Weitzman was in partnership with Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. Both of them were pro-Zionist, campaigning for the establishment of a Zionist state, and particularly within Palestine. So this is who they're making deals with, effectively.
Effectively, yes, and this is actually, what they're doing is he's just doing what the British tell him to. That bottom line, that's what it was really, basically. So it's the Paris Peace Conference is going on basically, and they invite Weitzman to that, so they're fulfilling their kind of agreement to them. But remember, what the British want is their colony there, so they're in their mind, they're facilitating their agenda to that. But effectively, what they're doing is they're giving him a say in the future of the region, and it's being endorsed by Hussein, as if
So
he's
what?
like
Sorry,
some
sorry.
kind of representative.
Yeah, Abdullah. So just really quickly, what year is this again? Sorry.
This is actually 1919. Okay?
Right. Okay. So this is
Okay.
this is after the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah,
This is before
it's
the
after
founding
that.
of the Zionist state, and they're he's saying we will allow the Zionists to have a
So-
say within the Arab world because he's been told
it's
that by the British.
Absolutely. So it's actually, it's the text of the agreement is actually His Royal Highness the Emir Faisal, representing and acting on behalf of the Arab Kingdom of Hijaz. Never existed before, they just invented it. And Dr. Chaim Weizmann, representing and acting on behalf of the Zionist organization, mindful of the racial kinship and ancient bonds between Arab and Jewish people, and realizing the surest means of working out the consummation of their natural aspiration is through the closest possible collaboration in development of the Arab state and Palestine, and being desirous of further of confirming the good understanding which exists between them, have agreed upon the following. And then the main points of the agreement are that both parties will have goodwill and understanding and work together to encourage immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale, while protecting the rights of the Arab peasants and tenant farmers to safeguard the free practice of religious observances. The Muslim holy places are to be under Muslim control. The Zionist movement undertakes to assist the Arab residents of Palestine to develop their natural resources and growing economy. Both parties committed to carrying into effect the Balfour Declaration of 1917, calling for a Jewish national home in Palestine. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? It's literally the idea that these nobodies can sign this in this peace conference and it's going to happen. Yeah. And even the way they refer to the indigenous people of Palestine, Arab peasants and farmers, it's like, so I don't know how much they paid the guy for this, but I guess maybe the Kingdom of Iraq was what he got at the end of it for it. These are why I call these people the Zionist Muslim rulers, because the first war, like I say, all these countries, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, they all go in there, but they're all going in it for themselves, their elites, and their colonial proxies who they're working for, British or France. Yeah. And the result of this war is like basically a massive change of the demographic. So literally at the end of this war, the first big change in the map occurs in 1949. It's really, this is for the same Faisal standing next to T.E. Lawrence here. And this is his brother, Abdullah, with John Bagat Glub or Glub Pasha in Jordan. So he became the king of Syria, but then was booted out. So he became the king of Iraq, and he became the king of Jordan. And his either great-grandson or grandson is currently the current king of Jordan. Okay, and this is Glub, the guy. Now,
The British
this guy has his
ambassador to Jordan.
Yeah, the British ambassador, basically. So this guy has his own betrayal. I mean, I don't know if okay, so King Abdullah, this guy, right? So Jordan actually made peace with the Zionist occupiers in, I think, 1994, 93 or 94, okay? Officially they made peace. So up till that point, they're supposed to be enemies, okay? Well, in 1947, 48, this guy is having backdoor conversations with leading Zionists to try and facilitate the British Peel Commission one-state solution. So he wants to be the leader, the king of the whole of Palestine and Jordan. And he's negotiating with the Zionists, basically saying, you work with me and I'll give you a good deal. Yeah. And it's actually, he's having deals with Golda Meir, who was later a prime minister. And there's a very controversial film about her these days, isn't there? Because she was the prime minister of the Zionist entity in 1973 during one of the wars. But basically, he was doing backdoor discussions with her and others at this time. I think I'm right in saying that this guy got assassinated because people knew his treachery for years, basically. And what you've seen in the subsequent decades, I mean, I'm going to condense this very much, is war and then peace, war and then peace. And at every stage, the wars are never really fought with any way to defend the Palestinian land, to defend the Palestinian people, to give them freedom and rescue them from help. They're never fought for those reasons. And the peace that's made afterwards has always sold them out.
So I was going to mention the point, which is that in all of these wars, well, most of these wars, I should say, it pretty much was the case that not only did these Arab regimes lose, but they also lost more land for Palestinians.
They lost more land.
And then as a result, that the peace that they did was a peace to recognize the losses, in essence.
Yeah, so if you take the 67 war, for example, which is the one where people talk about 1967 borders today. So 67 war was probably, they call it the 6-day war, but it was it was the war which effectively they lost the most, the Palestinians lost the most land, you could say, in one war. And this is an interesting one when you read the dynamics of this, because Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and the Zionists at this stage, they've all got slightly different allegiances to Britain, France, and America. All right. And remember, this is in this era between 1940s and 1970s, you know, these old colonial powers, France and Britain, they're wrestling a bit with America. They're allies of America, but they're also wrestling with them to try and retain control of their own influence. Yeah. And Britain had a real problem with Nasser in Egypt. They really hated Nasser. He badly affected British interests in Egypt. And history tells us, in retrospect, Nasser was a CIA agent. It's a well-recognized thing now. It was controversial at the time. If you'd said that in Egypt at the time, you'd probably get killed by a mob because he was so hero worshipped. Yeah, but in retrospect, very clear, documented, good links with the CIA. All right. Hussein of Jordan, the son of Abdullah, or grandson, I can't remember which, but he's the son. I think he's the son of Abdullah. He is very loyal to British. A Sandhurst man, actually. He was educated in Sandhurst.
Sandhurst, for the audience, is a military college, British military college, like West Point in America.
It's an elite British military college. Yeah, so he's a Sandhurst man. He sent his kids to be educated in Britain at some of the most famous private schools in this country. Okay, so he's a very loyal man to Britain, and he makes a security deal with Nasser, and they plan an invasion. Whoa, somehow the Zionists seem to know everything that's going to happen beforehand, and somehow they bomb the Egyptian runways even before the planes take off. Yeah, and as yeah, this is a disaster. Basically, this is a complete kind of like disaster. 67 war, 73 war, a few years later, so-called Yom Kippur War. Well, here's another one. This is one where where Syria and Egypt decide to go in, and Jordan say, no, I'm not going to go in. All right. And in just a couple of years back, declassified documents showed that King Hussein, this very same guy, who didn't officially make peace until 1993-94, when he was this old man, okay, he contacts the Israeli leadership and tells them, oh, by the way, Egypt and Syria are going to invade you in the coming days and weeks. He grasses them up, basically. Yeah, it's like you couldn't make it up. It is literally, you couldn't make it up. Yeah, and after each of these wars, there's peace deals, and the peace never favors the Palestinians. And this is really important to understand. And again, this is synergy between Zionists and colonialists. This is more peace deals with under Clinton, when Arafat made peace in the end as well. This is just a little timeline of all the different peace deals along the way, but I just want to give you one example, one taster of what these peace deals are like for the Palestinians. So one of the most famous one is the Oslo Accords, okay? The Oslo Accords, which then led to this, basically, this Arafat making peace, the PLO making peace after Jordan and Egypt have done so, okay? This is really depressing, guys. I'm really sorry to have to depress you like this, but this is the West Bank, right? Okay. If you remember, oh wow, that's good. I didn't realize I could do that. That's really good. So if we go back to one of our early slides, okay, and this is the transition we're looking at. This is the West Bank, right? Which ends up looking like the Balkans or an archipelago, like I said. It was back to 54. So after the Oslo Peace Accords, the West Bank is divided into 3 zones: Area A, B, and C. Area C, the orange part, is actually to be administered by Israel. Area A, the lighter grey part, is to be administered by the Palestinian Authority, and the policing is by the Palestinian Authority. And Area B, which is the darker grey areas, darker blue areas, which is 22%, the administration can be by the Palestinians, so cleaning the roads, cleaning the bins, keeping that sort of thing, right? But the security is done by the Israelis, okay? And this is because these are the areas where they've made their settlements in the West Bank, okay? Now, Area C, part to be controlled by Israel, is 60% of the West Bank. Area A, which the Palestinian National Authority is supposed to be in charge of wholly, is just 18%, and Area B, 22%. That was as a result of this amazing peace negotiation called the Oslo Accords for the Palestinians.
Just
That's
as a
the
quick
kind of deal the Palestinians get.
Yeah. So I was just going to mention 2 things. So effectively, the West Bank now is the agreement was effectively to allow even more in principle now. Maybe in the past it was the case that the Zionist entity was controlling the West Bank and having their soldiers, but now they've actually made a peace deal to solidify that control in certain key areas of that. And also, I was just going to mention you put Oslo 1995. Was there a reason why 95 or 93? Was it just a typo?
Sorry, did I make a
It's
mistake
90,
there?
yeah,
Sorry.
93, isn't it?
93, sorry, that is a typo. Yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for
Oh,
that.
okay, that's fine.
It's a typo. Okay. So, I mean, an Area C, that 60%, which is controlled by the Israelis, I mean, you've got about 300,000 Palestinians living in that area. They can't even get decent schooling. They have to travel very far to get schooling. The economy is poor for them. I mean, and this, even by their own international law, according to the international law, this was grabbed in the 67 war, and so they're not even meant to be in there. And but this was enshrined in Oslo, right? So effectively, the international community has allowed them to do this. Okay, so it's nonsense. This is criminal, frankly. Trump came in and actually didn't even pretend to offer something to the Palestinians. He had this different vision that if we get these other Arab states to make deals with the Zionists directly, the incentive can be that they all benefit economically, right? So, tourism, travel, trade, it's a win-win for everyone, he says, yeah? So, again, this is why I call them the Zionist Muslim rulers, basically. They are the real Zionist defense force, without question. The colonialists could not do what they do since 1948 without these people. They just couldn't do it. And at the same time, the Zionists are very happy doing deals with these people because it serves their agenda as well. Yeah. And, well, what do I have to say, really? This guy has 2 faces when it comes to Palestine over and over again, really. Erdogan of Turkey. And You know, future betrayal. We were all expecting a few weeks ago that the Saudis will make their deal. I don't say it's off the table, by the way, because when you see that history of what I said before here, war and then peace, all of us need to be very, very, very mindful about what follows in the subsequent days, weeks, and months. Okay, because if this can happen after war, if you get Egypt, Jordan, the PLO, and this is after 2 intifadas that they kind of they have this. Yeah, if you have these kind of sellout deals by these people after such bloody and terrible episodes of violence, then be very, very careful about what future betrayals we have. Yeah, and this is Netanyahu at the UN with his map, which shows a new Middle East where he doesn't even include Palestine in it. Basically, he's just taken the whole thing for themselves, right? And this was a point of tension with the Americans. So the Saudi deal, which Biden was trying to facilitate, was the carrot to try and get them to come back to America's vision of their little loyal colony. Okay, whereas this map is Netanyahu giving the Zionist vision of what they want. Neither of them are any good for the Palestinians, frankly. Neither of them serve the Palestinians. Neither of them are just in Islam. They're unacceptable. Sheikh Taqiyuddin Nabhani made this statement, which really actually summarizes this whole episode very, very well. He said, Israel is the shadow of the Arab regimes. Okay, so literally, like if you've got an object and light is cast on it and you have a shadow, yeah, the object is the Arab regimes, the Zionist Arab Muslim rulers. Yeah, Israel is their shadow. If they aren't there, that shadow would cease to exist, and 100% that's true, actually. And it's really important to remember this, because if you think the Zionist occupation today exists because of that geopolitical shake-up in the Middle East in the 19 teens after World War I. All right, so occupation militarily, division of the lands, proxy rulers, and the Zionist entity being for the abolition of the Khilafah. Right, it only exists because of the rest. If there was reunification of Muslim lands, sincere Islamic leadership, it would just literally evaporate. And I really think it would evaporate. I think they would recognize that it's just so, the people living there, the Zionists living there, would recognize it's so untenable. They would be on a plane back to their homes in Europe and America and elsewhere, basically. Okay, talking for a very long time. I don't want to belittle talking about how bad things are today. Maybe it's less relevant to my main thesis about Zionism, so I'm going to skip through this. The human cost is huge. Palestinians are dying every day, every year. I mean, these are years going from 2008 through to 2020. 22-23 has been a really bad year. Even in the West Bank in 23, there were literally already over 200 deaths. West Bank and Gaza, I mean, they cannot function. If you live in the West Bank, you cannot get to Jerusalem. You cannot get from one side, your job or family, maybe just the other side of the border. You cannot get to Gaza. These are supposed to be united lands, but they're not. Gaza has been besieged for 15 years. The West Bank is balkanized. It has about 500 movement obstacles in the West Bank, stopping people from getting from A to B easily. They're constantly having to go through roadblocks and checkpoints. You cannot function properly in that kind of area. As I say, there's this wall which divides the West Bank from the rest of the Palestinian territories. Settlements have grown massively in the West Bank, and they steal the land, they destroy the crops of the Palestinians, they kill Palestinians, they do it with impunity because it's in those orange areas, Area C and Area B, where the Zionists have the security force. So if the Palestinians trying to defend themselves, they'll get killed by the armed Zionist soldiers. Yeah. Settlements, by the way, just in case, settlements kind of conjures up some, maybe, I don't know, some like farm or ranch like in the Wild West or something like that. These are the settlements. They literally build cities in there. I visited Palestine once. We drove through the West Bank and you could see this built up area like this snaking through the countryside for like, I don't know, 15-20 minute drive. You're driving past this, it's open, like a country type road. So you're driving at about 40-50 miles an hour and it's at least 15 minutes to get through the whole thing. Killings, as I say, in the West Bank, just this year alone, it's over 200. Even last week, there were masses of killings in Jenin before what kicked off in Gaza this week. Al-Quds, we hear about increasing incursions into Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa by Zionists illegally coming in, occupiers coming in. And then when the people resist, in Ramadan, in recurrent years, the security forces come in, they trash the mosque, they beat the people. In Al-Quds, generally, they're demolishing houses. This is a very common strategy. They literally try and occupy house by house, demolishing houses. We knew about the protests in Sheikh Jarrah. Since 1967, the Zionists have demolished over 27,000 Palestinian homes. And they use these ridiculous ploys like they haven't got licenses, they're in need of repair, where's the paperwork, they just demolish it basically. And they don't give them permit requests when they need to get licenses. They don't facilitate it. They control the water of the region. Christians get spat on. I mean, this is the latest thing in the last few weeks where these settlers and occupiers with impunity, they're basically going to Christian Arabs and visitors from overseas who come there on pilgrimages, and they're literally just spitting on them. And with impunity, they're doing that. The siege of Gaza has been going on since 2007. I mean, Gaza is this very small area of land. It's literally, there's sea-locked on one side, landlocked on another side. There is a crossing into Egypt called the Rafah crossing, which the Egyptians blockade because they don't want refugees coming from Gaza into Egypt. 2 million people in a 5,000 square mile area. It's smaller than the city of Oslo, all right, but home to 3 times as many people. And 7 out of 10 are refugees, traumatized by war. Schools are run down, the water's undrinkable, mass unemployment, very young population, yeah, very, very young population. About 7% of the children have stunted growth, yeah. Even David Cameron said it's a prison camp. Okay, that's how he described it back in 2010. Deaths in Gaza before this episode in 7th of October, there'd already been 35 deaths this year. Okay, many mass casualties over the years. As of 12 hours ago this morning, the death count in the last week is 230, nearly 200. No, sorry, 2,300 to 2,400. That was the last figure I could find from Reuters this morning, and about 7,500 injured. And we are told 1 million displaced people in a week. Thank you, Brett, who's just said it has a population of 5,000 people per square mile, I think. I missed that. 5,026 people per square kilometer. Thank you, Brett. Really, really helpful statistic. The Zionist leaders, you got to get this. They talk about extreme right wing, extreme left wing. The recent government is unashamedly radically Zionist. They really don't care to be a puppet of the West. They want the whole land of Palestine and some of Jordan back. That's Netanyahu. This is Smotrich who believes it. He's got some pretty ugly beliefs. He actually lives in the occupied territories in settlements, basically. He also believes in changing the demographic. He talks about flooding the areas with Jewish settlers. And if the Palestinians kick up, then kill them, effectively. Yeah, he has no shame about believing that. Ben Gvir, very similar guy with a criminal record, probably guilty of personally murdering people, and a real thug. These guys, the West portrays them as really bad and really evil. They are really bad and really evil. But the trouble is, the West portrays the new unity government with people like Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid and these kind of people as kind of the good guys because they can deal with them. But they are also radical Zionists who they have a more gradual approach to subjugating the Palestinian population and depopulating the area. Many people will remember Tzipi Livni, a former foreign minister of the Zionist occupiers, and she said, Arabs, they can go and live in Jordan. You can go and live in other Arab countries. And she was talking about the so-called Israeli Arabs, the ones who live as citizens, full citizens of Israel. Yeah. So they all have the same agenda. They just have different means of getting there. The pendulum has swung away from the extreme right because Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and their gang are being blamed for what happened last week, and this unity government that's come in, their other players will be seen as more acceptable going forward. So this is what's happening there. But they're literally all Zionist thugs. Future, okay. What can I say? The present is pretty terrible. The past is extremely depressing. Okay. The future is good, man. The future is good. And I'll tell you why. Sykes-Picot and the division of the land, the abolition of the Khilafah. You know what? That's how it's going to change. And actually, we are foretold by prophecy from the Prophet ﷺ that Khilafah will re-emerge. So that land will be united again. There will be a righteous Islamic ruler. And key thing for everyone in this, guys, Muslim or non-Muslim, right? When Islam ruled the region, you actually had some justice there. You didn't have persecution of Jews. You didn't have persecution of Christians. In fact, one of the only reasons you have Jewish and Christian populations indigenous there is because they had protection under Islam, right? The aberrations to the last 1400 years have been the century of Crusader rule and the last century of colonial stroke Zionist involvement in the region. So actually, anyone who really wants peace, security, and justice and decency for people, they would realize that that will come under an Islamic system. The Islamic system doesn't expect people to become Muslim, right? No, the Islamic system means the system of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam is the system which organizes political life, organizes justice for everybody, organizes circulation of wealth in the society, etc., etc. Healthcare, food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare for all its citizens, regardless of where they are from. So this is the future, which is good for everyone, honestly, except for the people who steal land and oppress and murder Palestinians. Okay, and does the Muslim world have the capability? It sure does. The left-hand column is the military capability of the 14 closest countries to the Zionist occupiers. And the right-hand column is the Zionist occupiers. By every metric on expenditure, active armed forces, artillery, aircraft, naval craft, every metric, just these 14 countries, you're talking about between 7 and 10 to 1 ratio of strength in favor. I really don't believe, this is a personal belief, this is not, I can't assign this to anyone else but myself. I really don't believe there will be, when the resources of the Muslim world are united, I don't believe there will be a bloodbath. I believe actually these people, the ones who have something to be ashamed of, will leave. They will not stay around for a fight. I've been there, I've seen them, I've looked them in the eye. They are not a very brave people. I will tell you that. They really are not, okay? I had to push my 75-year-old mother in a wheelchair and they were terrified of me coming towards them with my mother in a wheelchair, and they had their armed guns pointing at us when we went to visit Hebron, shouting at us in Hebrew. I couldn't understand them. And seriously, I think I was more afraid of my school teacher at school than I was of this guy. He was terrified. Yeah, I can see why they shoot so many people. They've got their fingers on the triggers too much. They are absolutely terrified. They're terrified of me with a 75-year-old woman in a wheelchair. They've got a problem. Yeah, they got a serious problem. Yeah,
I remember when a similar, not that same story, but a similar situation where I was in the old city of Jerusalem, and obviously coming from the UK, and we're not used to seeing people with big guns, big rifles, and full body armor and all that type of thing, just patrolling the city and stuff. So I was just looking at that guy, and he just looked at him, and I saw him put his hand towards his gun that he had holstered. Yeah, he was getting worried because I was looking at him, and then he's normally you'd be in that situation, you'd be a bit worried, but I just thought, what? This guy's a bit of a coward, to be quite frank.
Yeah,
I've just come as a tourist.
I don't know how they live their lives like that, to be honest with you. They must be neurotic. They must be totally neurotic. I mean, the flight I went on from here, my family was the only Muslim family. There were some British people who were Orthodox Hasidic Jews who were obviously going for some kind of visit. They're pretty much keeping themselves on the plane. They're reading their texts and stuff. And then there were a lot of Israeli Jews on there, and they're very rude to each other and very rude to the staff on the plane. But the thing that struck me most was that when we were coming into land, they were absolutely petrified. And when the flight actually landed, they spontaneously broke into applause. I've never been on a flight where that's happened before, to be honest with you. I've never been on a flight where people broke into applause when they land, basically, because of the relief.
I've been on a couple, to be fair.
Have you? Okay,
yeah.
That was new to me. But seriously, I'm not joking. Everything else. I mean, people talking about what happened last week. Yeah, whatever anyone thinks about what happened last week, it showed that a few hundred people showed them that they were not invincible, and that neurosis, that collective neurosis there has just grown, and that neurosis is manifest in the massacre in Gaza at the moment. Yeah. And then finally, that is my final slide with words. This is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated by Ibn Asakir. And he mentions that this matter, the Khilafah, will continue after me in Al-Madinah, which it did in Khilafah Rashida. Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Uthman, and Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman were the Khulafa in Al-Madinah. And then he said it would move to Ash-Sham. And by the time of the Umayyad Khilafah, it was in Ash-Sham, indeed. And then to Iraq. And the Abbasid Khilafah was indeed in Iraq. And then to the city, which was what they used to call Constantinople, or what is today Istanbul, which indeed it was the capital. And then to Bayt al-Maqdis, which is Jerusalem. This is a prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so it will go to all these places. And it's been in all these places except Bayt al-Maqdis. It's never been the capital of the Khilafah. So if it reaches Bayt al-Maqdis, he said, then it would have reached its natural resting place, and no people who remove it will ever get their land back again from it. So actually the good news from the Prophet ﷺ is that one day Bayt al-Maqdis will be the capital city of the Khilafah. And that promise of Allah, that he is in full control, Prophet Allah's messenger, Allah's in full control of his affairs, is something that should really give us some confidence for the future. And I really pray that everyone watching can one day visit this great masjid mentioned in the Quran, mentioned in the Sunnah as one of the places that we should visit and enjoy the rewards of the prayer. It is a very beautiful masjid for many reasons. But what is most striking is the people. You fall in love with the people there. You feel you are in the sister place of Makkah and Medina. It's got a different flavor, but very much you feel you're in a sister place of Makkah and Medina. But extraordinary people, extraordinarily kind people, generous people, hospitable people, patient people, reliant on Allah people. And I really hope if you haven't been there that you get a chance to visit there in a free Jerusalem, Palestine, under the shade of Islam, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. I just wanted to address one. I'll Jazakallah khair for the presentation. Very detailed, mashallah. I just wanted to quickly address this issue, which was about how the final image.
Sorry to interrupt, Sharif.
Yeah.
Isa has said not Al-Aqsa. Isa, no. Please don't make that mistake. Can we put my slide up again? Yeah. Can we put my slide up again?
Yeah, 1 second.
Yeah.
So the whole
Isa,
area,
okay.
the whole area is Masjid Al-Aqsa.
Yeah. So Isa, you need to understand this. There is a huge compound, right, which this Dome of the Rock sits in the middle of. Okay, that whole compound is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, right?
Yeah.
And within that compound, there are several different buildings. The Dome of the Rock is one. The Qibli Masjid is this one here, the one I've got behind me. Yeah, this is called the Qibli Masjid in Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Okay, and then there's a Masjid al-Buraq and various other buildings and structures in there.
The Wailing Wall is where the Masjid Buraq is. The Wailing Wall.
Yes,
currently,
the Wailing Wall is the Buraq
Wall.
Wall. The Buraq Wall, and then there's another area underground called Al-Marwani, which is like an underground complex of halls, prayer halls in there. Yeah, so all of this is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So the Dome of the Rock is part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. In fact, it's got no different status to any other part of Masjid Al-Aqsa. If you pray in this, you get the reward of praying in Masjid Al-Aqsa. If you pray in the Qibli Mosque, you get the reward of praying in Masjid Al-Aqsa. So it is true that the Zionists, they revere this part very much. This is the part of the masjid that they think of as their center point. Okay. And I wonder whether these stories that go around saying, oh, this is not Masjid Al-Aqsa, this is, I wonder if it's deliberately come from the Zionists, because they have a vision of dividing this mosque, like they have divided the mosque in Hebron, Khalil. That mosque was once run by Muslims, once managed by the Muslims under the Islamic Authority. And Jews could visit there to visit the graves of the prophets. Now the Zionists have taken the whole thing over. They dictate which paths the Muslims can have, which days the Muslims can have it. And that happened by stealth and by force in Hebron. And they have the same vision for Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And I wonder whether they keep saying, oh, this is not Al-Aqsa, this is the Dome of the Rock, so that one day they hope they will take this and they will say, this is yours. And this is not right. This is all part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa.
It's interesting because obviously myself and Abdul Wahid, we've both been to Jerusalem, alhamdulillah. We've had that opportunity to go there. And so when you go there, you will know the walling around this region is the whole of it is Masjid Al-Aqsa. And interestingly, the reason why the Dome of the Rock was built, it was during the time of the Umayyads, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, I think it was. And when people looked at the skyline of Jerusalem, the old city, they saw churches and steeples and crosses. And so Abdul Malik, basically, he wanted to make because he wanted to show that this is a Muslim city. Yeah, it's governed by Muslims, even though other religions were allowed to be there. So he created the Dome of the Rock as to be the one which is the most striking across the skyline. So anybody who comes and visits it will know that this is a Muslim city because this is the most striking. So that's why the Dome of the Rock exists in terms of that particular dome. But like just to reiterate that point, if you go there, you will know the whole region. It's a massive area. It's like the size of Medina Masjid, effectively, maybe just a bit smaller. But it's that whole region that is Is Masjid al-Aqsa, yeah, not just
Yeah, and
not just the
it is.
mosque at the front, the building at the front.
Sharif, I don't know. I mean, that's very accurate what you just said about Abdul Malik bin Marwan, and there's a few things about that make it quite striking. And the first thing is that basic structure of the Dome of the Rock has existed since the time of Abdul Malik bin Marwan, which is just literally just shortly after. I've just added another picture to the presentation. Can you load it up again? I don't know why I can't seem to get it up. Let me just.
Yeah, 1 second.
Hang on. Maybe I've got it here. Hang on. I want from slides from Google Slides. Add Google Slides. Now, let me just see if I can.
Yeah, so it's yeah, we're talking about 1200, isn't it? 1200 years ago.
Yeah.
The Dome of the Rock.
So yeah, so it has. Unfortunately, it's on the presentation, but it's not loading on the thing again. No worries. But it's 1200 years ago. It's a very beautiful building. It's a very amazing building, and
I've got this one.
Okay. Let's see if I've got it on there. Oh yeah, there we are. Put the slide on. There we are. Yeah. So this Isa, I think this diagram explains it really, but everything inside that orange boundary is Al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And this is the Dome of the Rock, and this is the Qibli Masjid. In real life, strikingly, the Qibli Masjid is much bigger than the Dome of the Rock. But the way Abdul Malik has built it is actually, the Dome of the Rock is actually built on an elevated section of the mosque. So from the skyline, it stands out, like it looks much bigger and much more striking, because it's kind of, I think it's almost like an optical illusion. It's actually bigger on from a distance than it is in real life. It's not actually a very big, building. But yeah, I pray we can all go there and we can all inshallah visit and enjoy the benefit of the prayer in peace, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Abdul Wahid. We've taken a lot of your time. It was a very detailed presentation. I hope, alhamdulillah, I think there was a lot of people watching it today, and they stayed watching it throughout the whole of the presentation as well, alhamdulillah. So it was really good. I think it's something that we need to really appreciate and understand, because part of what we do on Thought Adventure Podcast, obviously it's a lot more intellectual and maybe to a certain extent, talking about atheism, etc., and academic and liberalism. But these types of times, we need to sort of really understand some of these subject areas in depth, understand it, because these things are fundamentally important, because the political realities today, if we just want to be pawns of it, then we just react to events. But if we want to be people who can effect change, then we have to educate ourselves. And one of the ways of educating ourselves is educating history. I think I can't remember who it said, but the famous saying goes, whoever doesn't learn from their history will endlessly repeat it. Yeah, and so we want to break that cycle, inshallah. So really appreciate that. Jazakallah khair. Hopefully, inshallah, everybody in the audience really enjoyed that. I couldn't get through all the comments. I'd have loved to read them out, but it's a detailed comment. But Jazakallah khair for everybody there watching this. Any final words that you want to say, Abdul Wahid? Anything that's happening in the next few days or so?
So of course, I think whatever little bits and snippets you picked up, please try and rebut the propaganda. Please, rebutting the propaganda doesn't just mean on social media and stuff. It means there's a lot of fair-minded, open-minded people out there that, like I say, they just think there's a conflict going on between people and it's been going on for hundreds of years, and what can you do? No, it's really important we educate people that there is a different story there. So do that. The other thing I will say, I'll give a quick plug, if I may. Next Saturday, on the 21st of October, I'm going to be, inshallah, at two embassies in London, the Egyptian embassy and the Turkish embassy, in the afternoon, as part of a protest. And the protest is really to say that, you know what, somebody capable with armies needs to go and rescue these people in Gaza and liberate that land. So I hope, inshallah, if any of you can come, please do.
Yeah, that's taking place in London. That'll be
In
next
London.
Saturday, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. So if we'll send a link maybe to Abdul Wahid's Twitter feed or Twitter page. I don't know what they call it now.
Yeah.
But his Twitter. So inshallah, you can contact him there. Abdul Wahid is also featured on Blogging Theology. Alhamdulillah, we had Paul Williams in the background watching today as well. So if you want to watch more of Abdul Wahid, you can also go to Blogging Theology, where he's featured on there a few times with various presentations. Again, Jazakallah khair. Appreciate your discussion. Actually, this is the second time you've been on our show, actually. So
I think so. Yeah, I think I was. Yeah, once before, a while back.
That's
now.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Alhamdulillah. So Jazakallah khair. Abdul Wahid, I'm going to give salams and then close the stream.
Alaikum assalam.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Take care, everyone.